The disappearance of a 37-year-old woman is being investigated after she went missing after leaving work in Canton in Cardiff on Saturday afternoon. South Wales Police have said that 2 people have been arrested in connection with the disappearance of Paria Veisi, and police have since found her car. Paria from Cardiff hasn't been seen since she left her work in Canton at around 3 p.m. on Saturday, April 12th, and was reported missing a day later. Her disappearance has been described as totally out of character, and police officers are concerned about her welfare after CCTV footage confirmed that she left the Canton area in her black Mercedes GLC 220. The black Mercedes was found on the evening of Tuesday, April 15th, on Waterloo Road in Penylan. Pictures from Penylan show a large police presence around a black car on Waterloo Road on Tuesday evening. Police are also carrying out door-to-door inquiries. Police have confirmed a 41-year-old man and a 48-year-old woman have been arrested in connection with her disappearance and are now in police custody. South Wales Police issued a description of the 37-year-old woman. They said Paria has long, curly black hair and was last seen wearing a black zip-up gym top over a red top, black trousers and trainers. They also said Paria was carrying a small handbag.
On a quiet street in Penylan, neighbours believed nothing unusual was happening. The houses stood neatly in rows, gardens carefully kept, and behind one home newly planted flowers sat peacefully beneath a set of patio slabs. To anyone passing by, it looked like an ordinary garden. But beneath that soil, hidden from sight, lay a secret so dark that it would soon shock the entire community. This is the story of Paria Veisi, a 37-year-old woman who had recently made a difficult decision. After years of living in fear, she had finally walked away from her marriage. Friends say she wanted a fresh start, a life without intimidation, without violence, and without the man she once trusted. That man was Alireza Askari. To the outside world, the couple's life had once seemed ordinary. They had moved from Iran to the United Kingdom years earlier, settling in the Welsh capital of Cardiff and building what appeared to be a stable home together. But behind closed doors, the relationship had begun to fracture. By April, everything had changed. Paria had left the house they once shared. She had told friends she was afraid of her husband. She wanted distance. She wanted safety. Most importantly, she wanted a divorce. But sometimes, walking away from the wrong person can be the most dangerous decision of all. Because while Paria was planning a new chapter in her life, investigators would later discover that Askari was planning something far more sinister. Phone records would reveal that he had been messaging a woman overseas, believed to be a girlfriend in Iran. In one chilling message, he wrote words that would later echo through a courtroom. "I'm planning for them to kill her in Iran." Whether it was a threat or a twisted fantasy, no one could be sure. But what happened next would prove that the danger Paria feared was very real. On the afternoon of April 12, an ordinary day unfolded across Cardiff. People went to work. Children returned home from school. Shops buzzed with customers. At around 4:30 p.m. inside a conservatory at the house in Penylan, something horrific was happening. Prosecutors would later say that earlier that day, Askari had visited a local supermarket. There, he purchased a set of kitchen knives. He returned home with them. What happened next inside that house would remain known only through forensic evidence and the grim reconstruction of detectives. But the result was undeniable. Paria Veisi was brutally stabbed. When the violence ended, she lay lifeless inside the home she had once tried to escape. For most killers, that moment is the end of the crime. But for Askari, it was only the beginning. Because instead of calling for help, instead of admitting what he had done, investigators say he began planning how to make Paria disappear forever. That evening, behind the quiet home in Penylan, a makeshift grave was prepared. Soil was disturbed. Patio slabs were lifted. And under the cover of darkness, the body of a 37-year-old woman who had dreamed of a new life was buried beneath the garden of the house she had once shared with her killer. To hide the freshly turned earth, flowers were planted. From the outside, everything looked peaceful. But the secret would not stay buried for long. Because somewhere in Cardiff, one of Paria's friends had begun to worry. And that worry would soon trigger a chain of events that would expose the chilling truth hidden beneath that garden. The concern began quietly. At first, it was nothing more than a feeling that something wasn't right. A friend of Paria Veisi noticed that her messages had suddenly stopped. For someone who was normally active and communicative, the silence felt strange. Paria had been going through a difficult period, but she still checked in with people she trusted. Then the messages finally came. But something about them felt wrong. The tone was unusual, the wording didn't sound like her. The explanation seemed forced, almost mechanical. To the friend reading them, it didn't feel like Paria at all. And that uneasy feeling refused to go away. For days, the silence surrounding Paria had been growing heavier. She had recently separated from her husband, Alireza Askari, and had begun trying to rebuild her life away from the home they once shared in Penylan. Those close to her knew the separation had not been easy. Behind the polite smiles and normal appearances, Paria had confided something deeply troubling to her friends. She was afraid of Askari. Not the kind of fear that fades after an argument, not the kind of tension that many couples experience. This was deeper. This was the quiet fear that comes from living with someone unpredictable. Friends later told investigators that Paria had described emotional abuse inside the marriage. She had spoken about intimidation and control, about the constant pressure that had slowly pushed her toward a decision she believed was necessary for her safety. She wanted a divorce. To many people that decision might sound simple, but for Paria it carried a weight she could not ignore. Leaving meant confrontation. Leaving meant anger. And leaving meant facing a man who, according to prosecutors, would eventually decide that if he couldn't control her life, he would end it. But none of that was visible yet. All that existed at the moment was silence. And that silence was becoming impossible to ignore. The friend who had grown increasingly worried finally made a decision that would change everything. They contacted the police. Soon, officers from South Wales Police began looking into the situation. At first, it was treated as a missing person case. Situations like this happen all the time. People leave suddenly, cut off contact, disappear temporarily while trying to deal with personal problems. But the more investigators examined the circumstances, the more troubling the situation became. Paria had not told anyone she was planning to travel. She had not withdrawn money. She had not contacted close friends or family. And perhaps most worrying of all, the last known place she had been seen was the house she once shared with the man she had recently left. The home in Penylan. Detectives quickly realized they needed to speak with Alireza Askari. At that moment, Askari appeared calm. Too calm. He did not immediately behave like a man whose wife, or ex-wife, had suddenly vanished. Instead, according to investigators, he attempted to present a story that suggested Paria had simply gone away. But detectives were already beginning to notice cracks in the explanation. Because technology rarely lies. When officers began examining digital evidence, the timeline surrounding Paria's disappearance started to reveal disturbing details. Phone records showed that Askari had been sending messages to a woman in Iran before the murder. Investigators believe the woman was his girlfriend. Some of the messages would later shock the courtroom. In one chilling line, Askari wrote words that would later be repeated again and again during the trial. "I'm planning for them to kill her in Iran." At the time, the meaning of the message was unclear. Was it a threat, a twisted fantasy, a cruel joke? But investigators now had to ask a frightening question. Had Paria been in danger long before she disappeared? While detectives worked to piece together the timeline, another discovery would raise even more suspicion. Security footage from a supermarket in Cardiff showed Askari shopping on the day Paria vanished. He wasn't buying groceries. He wasn't buying household supplies. Instead, he purchased a set of kitchen knives. The purchase happened just hours before Paria was last seen alive. For investigators, this detail changed everything. Because when someone buys knives shortly before a person disappears, it becomes impossible to ignore. As detectives continued reviewing footage and transactions, they discovered something else. After the suspected time of the killing, Askari returned to the supermarket again. But this time, the items he bought were different. Bleach, compost, and plants. To an ordinary shopper, those items might seem harmless. But to experienced detectives, they raised a disturbing possibility. Bleach is often used to destroy evidence. Compost and plants can hide disturbed soil. The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to fall into place. But there was still no body. And without a body, proving a murder can become far more difficult. Investigators needed more. They needed something concrete. Something physical. Something that could confirm their growing suspicion that the quiet home in Penylan was hiding something terrible. Then another discovery pushed the investigation forward. Phone records showed that shortly after the suspected killing, Askari made a call. Not to the police. Not to a lawyer. But to a relative. Miriam de Lavery. De Lavery was Askari's aunt. She lived hundreds of miles away in London. Yet records showed that shortly after the murder, she began travelling toward Cardiff. Prosecutors would later argue that this journey had a very specific purpose. She wasn't coming to visit. She wasn't coming to offer comfort. She was coming to help cover up a crime. As the investigation unfolded, detectives realized they were dealing with more than just a disappearance. They were dealing with a carefully constructed attempt to erase a person completely. To make it appear as if Paria Veisi had simply vanished from the world. But something else happened that Askari likely never expected. The people in Paria's life refused to let her disappear quietly. Friends kept asking questions. Family members demanded answers. And the police investigation continued to tighten around the house in Penylan. Meanwhile, Askari appeared to be making plans of his own. 3 days after the suspected murder, officers located him driving along the motorway between Birmingham and Cardiff. When they stopped the vehicle, what they found inside raised even more alarm. In the car were canisters containing caustic soda. To most people, the chemical might sound unfamiliar. But investigators knew exactly what it could be used for. Caustic soda is capable of breaking down organic material. In other words, it can be used to destroy a body. For detectives, this discovery was chilling, because it suggested that the crime might not be finished. Instead, they believed Askari could be planning something even more horrifying. The complete destruction of Paria Veisi's remains. At that moment, the missing person case had reached a turning point. Askari was arrested. Now detectives needed to find the truth. And there was only one place left to look. The house in Penylan. Soon, forensic teams began searching the property carefully. Every room was examined. Every surface was tested. But the most important search would happen outside. In the garden. At first glance, the area looked normal. Fresh soil. Neatly arranged patio slabs. And newly planted flowers. But to experienced investigators, something about the ground looked disturbed. It didn't match the rest of the garden. The soil was too fresh. The plants were too new. And the positioning of the slabs looked deliberate. Slowly, carefully, officers began removing them. What they found beneath would confirm the worst fears of everyone involved in the investigation. Hidden below the soil was a makeshift grave. And inside that grave lay the body of Paria Veisi. The woman who had tried to escape her marriage had been buried in the garden of the house she once called home. For the detectives standing there, the discovery was both tragic and infuriating. Because the evidence suggested something deeply disturbing. Paria hadn't just been killed. Her killer had tried to erase her. To hide her beneath flowers and stone. To make it seem as though she had never existed at all. But now the truth was emerging from the ground itself. And as forensic teams examined the body, the details of her final moments would reveal just how brutal the attack had been. The examination showed that Paria had suffered multiple stab wounds. The injuries were concentrated around her chest and neck. 4 deep wounds, each one delivered with lethal force. Each one confirming that this was not an accident. This was murder. Cold, deliberate, and calculated. But even as investigators documented the evidence, another question remained. If Askari had committed the killing alone, Why had his aunt rushed from London to Cardiff? What exactly had she done after arriving? And how much did she really know? Those questions would soon lead detectives into an even darker part of the investigation. Because the murder of Paria Veisi was not just about one man's rage. It was about the desperate lengths people will go to hide the truth. And as the investigation continued, the role of Miriam de Lavery would reveal that the cover-up had already begun long before the police arrived at that garden. The deeper detectives looked, the more disturbing the story became. And what they would uncover next would show just how far the killer had gone to try to escape justice. The discovery in the garden transformed the investigation overnight. What had begun as a missing person case was now a confirmed homicide. For the detectives from South Wales Police, the grim scene behind the quiet house in Penylan revealed the truth that many had feared from the beginning. Paria Veisi had not disappeared. She had been murdered. And someone had gone to extraordinary lengths to hide it. As forensic investigators carefully documented the makeshift grave, the details of the cover-up became increasingly disturbing. The patio slabs had been placed deliberately, covering freshly disturbed soil. Beneath them, investigators found layers of dirt mixed with compost, suggesting that the burial had been carried out in haste. But the attempt to disguise the grave had not stopped there. Flowers had been planted on top. To anyone casually looking at the garden, it might have seemed like a simple attempt to improve the property. But to detectives, the message was chilling. Someone had tried to hide a body in plain sight. And the evidence pointed directly to one man. Alireza Askari. By the time investigators uncovered Paria's body, Askari was already in custody. Officers had intercepted him days earlier while he was driving along the motorway between Birmingham and Cardiff. Inside his vehicle, they found containers of caustic soda. To detectives, this discovery suggested something terrifying. If Paria's body had not already been found, investigators believe Askari may have attempted to destroy it completely. Caustic soda is capable of dissolving organic material. In other words, it can be used to erase evidence. For investigators, the implication was clear. This was not a crime committed in the heat of the moment. It was a crime followed by careful, calculated planning. Back at the property in Penylan, forensic teams continued to examine every inch of the house. Inside the conservatory, the glass-enclosed room at the back of the property, detectives believed the murder had taken place. Although efforts had been made to clean the scene, forensic testing soon revealed traces that could not be completely erased. Blood evidence, microscopic fragments, patterns invisible to the naked eye. Even when bleach had been used, advanced forensic techniques were able to reveal what had happened there. Investigators concluded that Paria had been attacked inside that room around 4:30 in the afternoon on April 12. The attack was violent and deliberate. The post-mortem examination later confirmed that she had suffered multiple stab wounds to her chest and neck. 4 wounds in total, each one capable of causing fatal injury. For the detectives reconstructing the timeline, one detail stood out. Earlier that same day, Askari had visited a supermarket. Security footage showed him purchasing a set of kitchen knives. He returned home shortly afterward. The timing was impossible to ignore. To prosecutors, it suggested preparation. The weapon had not been grabbed impulsively during an argument. It had been purchased hours before the attack. As investigators continued to build the timeline, another element of the story began to emerge. It involved someone who had not been present during the killing, but who would later play a crucial role in what happened afterward. Askari's aunt, Miriam de Lavery. Phone records showed that shortly after the killing, Askari had contacted de Lavery, who lived in London. Within hours, she began making arrangements to travel to Cardiff. According to prosecutors, this journey was not made out of concern. It was made to assist in a cover-up. De Lavery travelled by taxi from London to Cardiff, arriving at the property where Paria's body had already been buried. What happened during that visit would later become a key part of the prosecution's case. Investigators believed de Lavery helped Askari clean the property and remove evidence of the crime. The exact details of her involvement would later be examined in court, but prosecutors argued that she knowingly participated in attempts to conceal the murder. For detectives, the situation raised troubling questions. Why would someone travel across the country to assist in cleaning up after a violent killing? What had Askari told her during that phone call? And most importantly, how much did she know? While investigators pursued these questions, they were also uncovering disturbing evidence from Askari's digital life. His phone contained messages exchanged with a woman in Iran. Prosecutors believed the woman was his girlfriend. These conversations painted a revealing picture of Askari's mindset before the murder. One particular message would later echo through the courtroom during the trial. "I'm planning for them to kill her in Iran." At first glance, the statement seemed almost unbelievable. But for prosecutors, it demonstrated something critical. Askari had been thinking about eliminating Paria long before the attack in Cardiff. Whether the message was serious or not, it showed that violence had entered his thoughts. And by April 12, those thoughts had become reality. Friends of Paria later told investigators that she had been deeply unhappy in the marriage. She had confided in them about her fears. She had described arguments and controlling behavior. And when she finally decided to leave the relationship, she believed she was taking the first step toward freedom. But that decision would ultimately place her in greater danger. Because for Askari, the separation represented something he could not accept. Prosecutors later argued that he killed Paria because she wanted a divorce. Because she had rejected him. And because he wanted to move forward with another relationship. The hypocrisy of the situation was not lost on the court. At the same time that Askari was pursuing a relationship with another woman, prosecutors said he was unwilling to allow his wife to leave him. Instead, they argued, he chose a brutal solution. Murder. As the investigation progressed, the evidence against Askari became overwhelming. Forensic evidence linked the killing to the house. Digital records revealed suspicious communications. Supermarket purchases connected him to the murder weapon. And the discovery of Paria's body in the garden confirmed that someone had tried to hide the crime. But the investigation was not finished yet, because detectives still needed to understand the full extent of the cover-up. What exactly had Askari done in the hours and days after the murder? Why had he purchased bleach, compost and plants? And what role had Maryam de Lavry played in helping him conceal the truth? The answers to those questions would eventually emerge in court. And when they did, the full story of what happened inside that quiet house in Penylan would shock everyone who heard it. Because the murder itself was horrifying. But the calculated attempt to erase every trace of Paria Veisi was even more disturbing. And as prosecutors prepared to present their case, the evidence would reveal just how determined Askari had been to make his ex-wife disappear forever. But the truth, as investigators had already discovered, cannot stay buried forever. Even when it is hidden beneath patio slabs, soil and freshly planted flowers. And soon, a courtroom in Cardiff would hear the chilling details of a crime that began with jealousy, escalated into violence, and ended with a desperate attempt to hide the unthinkable. The courtroom in Cardiff was silent, as the details of the case were laid out piece by piece. By the time the trial reached its most critical stage at Cardiff Crown Court, investigators had already assembled a powerful body of evidence. The story that emerged was not just about a violent act. It was about control, obsession, and a desperate attempt to erase the consequences of murder. At the center of it all was Alireza Askari, the man prosecutors described as responsible for the cold-blooded murder of his former partner, Paria Veisi. For Paria's family, the trial was an agonizing experience. Every detail revealed in court forced them to relive the horror of what had happened to the woman they loved. But it was also their chance to finally understand the truth. Prosecutors began by reconstructing the final days of Paria's life. They described how the couple had originally moved to the United Kingdom from Iran in 2010, hoping to build a future together. Like many immigrants arriving in a new country, they had worked to establish a home and a life in Cardiff. But the relationship had gradually deteriorated. By April, the marriage had effectively collapsed. Paria had left the house in Penylan and was living separately from Askari. She had confided in friends that she feared him and wanted a divorce. That decision would ultimately seal her fate. Prosecutors argued that Askari could not accept losing control of the relationship. Instead of allowing Paria to move on with her life, he began thinking about ways to remove her from it completely. Evidence presented in court revealed that he had been communicating with another woman in Iran. Text messages recovered from his phone painted a disturbing picture. While pursuing a relationship with someone else, Askari was simultaneously expressing hostility toward Paria. One message stood out above all others. "I'm planning for them to kill her in Iran." The statement sent a chill through the courtroom when it was read aloud. Whether the message had been serious or not, prosecutors argued that it showed a pattern of thinking that eventually escalated into real violence. Then the timeline moved to April 12, the day of the murder. Prosecutors explained how Askari had gone to a supermarket in Cardiff that day and purchased a set of kitchen knives. Security footage captured the transaction. It would later become a critical piece of evidence. Shortly after returning home, investigators believe he confronted Paria inside the conservatory of the house they once shared. What happened next lasted only moments, but the consequences would echo for years. During the attack, Askari stabbed Paria multiple times. The medical examination later confirmed that she had suffered 4 stab wounds, primarily to the chest and neck. Each wound demonstrated the force used during the assault. The injuries were not defensive or accidental. They were lethal. When the violence ended, Paria Veisi was dead. But according to prosecutors, Askari's actions after the murder revealed just how determined he was to hide the truth. Instead of reporting the crime, he immediately began attempting to erase the evidence. The first step was the burial. Behind the house in Penylan, Askari dug a makeshift grave in the garden. He placed Paria's body inside and covered it with soil. Then he added another layer of concealment. Patio slabs were placed over the grave. Finally, flowers were planted on top of the disturbed soil. From the outside, the garden looked perfectly ordinary. But beneath those flowers lay the body of a woman whose only mistake had been trying to escape a dangerous relationship. Prosecutors told the court that Askari did not stop there. He returned to the supermarket and purchased bleach, compost and plants. The bleach was intended to destroy forensic evidence inside the house. The compost and plants were used to disguise the burial site in the garden. But perhaps the most shocking part of the cover-up involved another person. Askari's aunt, Mariam Delavry. Phone records showed that shortly after the murder, Askari contacted Delavry in London. Instead of alerting authorities, she travelled to Cardiff by taxi. Prosecutors told the court that she came to assist her nephew in hiding the crime. During the trial, the prosecution described how Delavry helped clean the property and remove potential evidence. Her involvement did not go unnoticed by investigators. When the case eventually reached court, Delavry admitted to perverting the course of justice, acknowledging that she had taken part in efforts to conceal the murder. But despite the attempts to clean the house and hide the body, the truth eventually surfaced. The turning point came when one of Paria's friends reported her missing to South Wales police. The friend had grown suspicious after receiving strange messages that did not sound like Paria. Those concerns triggered the missing person investigation that ultimately led detectives to the house in Penylan. From there, the investigation unfolded rapidly. Askari was arrested on April 15 while driving between Birmingham and Cardiff. Inside his vehicle, officers discovered canisters containing caustic soda. Prosecutors later argued that these chemicals were intended to destroy Paria's remains. If the police had not intervened when they did, investigators believe the body might have been permanently destroyed. But the plan never had the chance to succeed. Shortly after Askari's arrest, detectives searched the house in Penylan. When they examined the garden, they noticed the recently disturbed soil beneath the patio slabs. Once the slabs were lifted, the truth was revealed. the makeshift grave, and inside it the body of Paria Veisi. The discovery confirmed everything investigators suspected. The disappearance had been a murder. During the sentencing hearing, the judge delivered a powerful statement addressing Askari directly. He described the killing as a cold-blooded murder. He also spoke about the devastating impact the crime had on Paria's family. She was in the prime of her life, the judge said. Her death has destroyed her family's happiness. The court also heard how Paria had lived in fear of Askari during their marriage. Friends testified that she had confided in them about the abuse she experienced. She had wanted freedom. Instead, she lost her life. When the sentencing was announced, Askari was ordered to serve life imprisonment with a minimum term of 26 years. The judge also condemned the lengths he had gone to in order to hide the crime. "You did everything in your power to cover up the murder," he said. "You tried to destroy evidence and hinder the police investigation." For Maryam de Lavery, the consequences were also severe. Her role in the cover-up resulted in a prison sentence of 5 years and 6 months for perverting the course of justice. As the trial concluded, one fact remained painfully clear. Paria Veisi had tried to escape a life of fear. She had tried to build a future free from abuse. But the man she left behind refused to let her go. Instead, he committed a crime so brutal that it shocked the entire community of Cardiff. And although he attempted to bury the truth beneath patio slabs, soil and flowers, justice eventually uncovered what he had tried so desperately to hide. The quiet garden in Penylan would forever stand as a reminder of a crime that began with control, escalated into violence, and ended with a desperate attempt to make a woman disappear. But thanks to the determination of investigators, friends, and the justice system, the truth was finally brought to light. And the voice of Paria Veisi, once silenced, would now be remembered through the story of what happened to her.